Okay, let's look at the political problems that ensued in the imperialism era. But we're going to look at Latin America and the Americas in general. We'll look at Canada as well. So if you remember Simon Bolivar and his dream of one Latin America with the same language, religion, and cultural heritage, well, that did not come to pass. So Latin American countries won their independence in the early 1800s, but 20 separate nations emerged. They set up new constitutions that were modeled after the U.S. and created republics with elected legislatures. And yet, they were still plagued by revolts and dictatorships. Power struggles erupted frequently, and Latin American economies became increasingly dependent on more developed nations. So, Britain and the U.S. both heavily invested in Latin America. Now, many of the problems in Latin America could be traced to colonial rule, because Spain and Portugal kept a tight rein on these colonies, giving them little experience with self-government. So if you look at the contrast of the United States, while still colonies of Britain in the 1600s and 1700s, they still had experience with self-government. So Britain managed it from afar, but they had their own colonial government. So there's some experience with governing themselves. So Spain and Portugal really did not allow that to happen in Latin America. It would just put its own people in power positions there. So that was a problem, just that lack of experience. The social hierarchy remained entrenched. So even though the Creoles were able to advance a little bit, they were the Europeans who were born in the Americas, but were still Europeans. The other groups did not advance socially with the independence of Latin America. So mestizos, mixed natives and European, and mulattoes, blacks, and natives just did not gain any traction in the social hierarchy at all. Deep social prejudices and land and power remained in the hands of the few. The Roman Catholic Church also kept a tremendous amount of power and privileges and controlled vast amounts of land. And another issue is that there are very few roads and little infrastructure. And so there wasn't a lot of integration or interaction inland. And that also made economic and other developments a little bit more hindered. And so there wasn't a tradition of loyalty to a nation state. And new nations tended to be weakened by regionalism. So regionalism is loyalty to a local area and to local strongmen called caudillos. Alright. So this really hindered, I guess, a national unity, you could say. Caudillos assembled their own private armies to resist a central government. They did not want a central government. But popular caudillos sometimes gained national attention or power, and sometimes they just ended up looting the treasury. They completely ignored the Constitution and were supported by the military and ruled as de facto dictators. So the other issue was that there would be power struggles among competing strongmen, and that led to more revolts. In Latin America, there tended to be a power struggle between conservatives and liberals. Conservatives tended to defend the traditional social order. They favored press censorship. They strongly supported the Catholic Church, and they wanted to maintain the current social order, fearing that change would bring chaos and disorder. Liberals defended Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty, favored laissez-faire economics, supported religious toleration, and sought to weaken the Catholic Church by breaking up its land holdings and ending its monopoly on education. So, Mexico also had a struggle with internal stability. They, let's look at Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. So from 1833 to 1855, he was a caudillo, was very strategic and cunning. He gained and lost power many times. He first allied with Spain during Mexico's War of Independence, but he switched sides when he saw that Spain was losing. And then when he saw that he could probably get more traction as a liberal reformer, he posed as a liberal reformer. The truth was, he reversed his stance and ruled as a dictator. So settlers in Mexico's northern territory of Texas took advantage of the chaos in Mexico, and they sought independence in 1835. So many settlers had moved to Texas from the United States. This is not part of the United States then, remember that. Wanted to ensure a stable government. Santa Anna marched in to crush the rebels, but was ultimately defeated. And in 1836, Texas became an independent republic. In 1846, the United States annexed Texas, and then war broke out between Texas and the U.S. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended war, and Mexico lost half of its territory to the United States. Santa Anna was forced into exile, and now violence erupted between the conservatives and the liberals. And we should really say that war broke out between Mexico and the U.S. So, La Reforma. In 1855, Benito Juárez gained power and opened an era of liberal reform. He sort of offered hope to people of different social classes, or I should say the lower classes, because he was part Zapotec native. And some of the things that he was responsible for was revising the Mexican Constitution, stripping the military of power, and ending special privileges of the church. Conservatives resisted him and unleashed a civil war and turned to Europe for help. And as it happened, Mexico had large debts to France, so that was a pretty good group to turn to. So Napoleon III sent troops to Mexico and set up an Austrian archduke as emperor. Maximilian was his name. And Juárez's forces battled against the Mexican conservatives and the French forces for 4 years. And finally, France withdrew, and Max was executed. And Juárez returned to power until he died in 1872. So, one of the things that he's credited with is bringing mestizos into politics. And then he also separated the church and state and helped to unite Mexico more as a country with a national identity. So remember, before that, it had more of a kind of, it was just a collection of regional identities. So he's helping to foment that national identity. So, after Juárez, General Porfirio Diaz, who was a hero of the war against the French, he used his military to seize power. He pretty much ruled as a dictator from 1876 to 1880, and then 1884 to 1911. And the motto was Order and Progress. He strengthened the army, the local police, and the central government, and opposition was brutally crushed. So some things that came out of this period were economic advances, increased foreign trade, development of industry, and expansion in mining. But the problem was that the capital for development came from foreign investors, and that means that Diaz had to grant special rights and favors. And he also let wealthy landowners buy up native land. So the rich prospered and the poor fell into a peonage system to employers. And it's a kind of indentured servitude that is hard to get out from. And children also worked 12-hour days and were not educated. So it was not a very progressive era. Here we see the map of the economics of Latin American dependence. It shows European and U.S. possessions in Latin America in the 1900s. And imperialists often asked to protect business interests. So even if some of these countries had sovereignty, they still had so much foreign influence economically that they didn't quite have the autonomy, the total autonomy they might have desired. So, one thing to keep in mind is that under colonial rule, Latin America was economically dependent on Spain and Portugal. They sent out their raw materials, but had to buy manufactured goods from them, and they were not allowed to trade with others. So they really were not able to develop their own economy. And after independence, not much had changed. I mean, they did gain free trade, but Britain and the U.S. essentially replaced Spain as a trading partner. And the problem is that more economically advanced or developed nations control prices and terms. Foreign investment. A flood of foreign investment in Latin America had a dark side because investors would interfere with political events or reforms in Latin America to sustain the advantage. But even though certain reforms might be good for the overall populace, a lot of the time foreign investors would meddle in their affairs to prevent this because it wasn't good for their own interest, really. So that was an impediment to Latin America's development. The economy grew in Latin America because of the foreign need for raw materials. Some of the benefits that occurred, even though it seemed to kind of benefit the other countries or the foreign investors, was the development of mining, because foreign investors put a lot of money into developing the infrastructure for mining. They also invested in modern ports and railroads to carry goods to the interior. And European immigrants poured into LA, and a small middle class emerged. And when I say LA, I mean Latin America. Very little wealth really trickled down to the masses, however. So, some of the exports was that Chile had copper and nitrites, Argentina had expanded their wheat production and livestock, and Brazil, had coffee, rubber, and sugar. So, all of these are important items. This chart really shows that cycle of economic dependence in Latin America. And when you're looking at it, think of what the developed nations provided to Latin America. They did provide manufactured goods, capital, and technological know-how. So, I'm going to stop here because time is running out, and then I'm going to keep narrating the rest of the slide.